Hello, I'm Trixie Smith, I'm 17 years old and I study Spanish, and so today's lecture is going to be on one of my favourite cineastas, as one might say, or Spanish filmmakers, Pedro Almodóvar. I'm going to talk you through and discuss some of his most distinct and signature characteristics which run throughout his work, run throughout his films, including the contrast we see between past and present, the key role that women play in Almodóvar's films, some of the Brechtian distancing techniques that Almodóvar uses, and most famously, most notably, his iconic use of colours and visuals. To begin with some context, Pedro Almodóvar was born in the region of La Mancha in Spain. This is a rural area with a very tight-knit community, a sort of everybody knowing everybody spirit. And so after the death of Francisco Franco in 1975, there was a cultural movement called La Movida Madrileña. This was a kind of exodus of all those who had been oppressed and held back by the harshness of the attitudes that had prevailed throughout the dictatorship. And this was a congregation of people in the sort of multiculturalism and hope of the metropolis that was Madrid of the 1980s. And among those was young Pedro Almodóvar, along with all the other artists and people that congregated in Madrid hungry for change. In Almodóvar's own words, La Movida Madrileña was an explosion of personal freedom equal to the repression that we had felt. And so we can see this idea of not wanting to lose sight of one's own identity, wanting to remain firmly attached to your rural roots, where you've come from, but also wanting to express oneself and exploring the new sort of possibilities and hope that La Movida brings. And so, using the example of one of Pedro Almodóvar's most iconic films, Volver, which was made in 2006, we can see lots of examples of Spanish traditional culture. For example, at the very beginning, lots of characters greet each other with multiple kisses on the cheek, which is something typical of people from La Mancha region. We also have examples of there's a culture of using Tupperware to sort of make food for friends and family and leaving that for other people to find. So that kind of linking to Almodóvar's past, wanting to express that, but at the same time wanting to come out of your shell. We can see that in the kitchens of Almodóvar's films. So in Hable con ella, we can see a very traditional Galician kitchen. So we've got like tiles and crockery, which has traditional Galician patterns on. You've got like dried and cured meats and different items of food hanging up in the kitchen. This is a very, very typical traditional kitchen, which would have been also typical of something you might have seen during the dictatorship. However, in other films, you've got kitchens which are completely clean, brand new, modern style, stripped back because you don't have to hide anymore. There's nowhere to hide, and this is the sort of openness that you can feel and express in these sort of new modern times of La Movida. If we zoom in on this idea of the kitchen, something that is very characterizing of women being sort of chained to the kitchen, that idea of a sort of maternal housewife figure. In Almodóvar's films, we can see that the women use this space of the kitchen to both rebel and sort of act within the conventions. So Almodóvar uses women as the stars of his show. He has a select sort of solid cast of female actresses, including Penélope Cruz, Carmen Maura, which he uses in most of his films as the sort of keystone of his work. And so we get to see this sort of new woman, alluding to these images of like the sort of dark and mysterious Mediterranean woman with new ideas, lots of contradicting emotions, and someone who's quite striking and not afraid to be themselves. In Almodóvar's films, we see in the kitchens women sort of making mischief, making concoctions to kill their husbands, or for example at the beginning of Volver, we see the murder scene of Paco and his sort of sexual advantages that he takes of his supposed daughter Paula. Spoiler alert, he ends up not being her father. And so in Almodóvar's films, the women are very multifaceted and deep characters, as opposed to the sort of in contrast with the one-dimensional males in his films. And he has been criticized by women's rights activists for being a chauvinist, even in his films. But in my opinion, and in the opinion of many, this doesn't take away from his style, because in his films, women are not defined by the male characters. They have their own voices and they define themselves. Sort of taking you back to the sort of Italian neo-realism, actresses like Carmen, like Sophia Loren, we get to see that sort of echoed in Carmen Maura and in Penélope Cruz. And one could say that in Pedro Almodóvar's films, they are a homage to all of the strong women he was surrounded by in his infancy growing up in La Mancha, and he uses the platform which he gained after La Movida to sort of respect them and to take him back to that time. Almodóvar's use of cinematic shots, different shots, is something that's quite iconic in his films, and so linking sort of together the idea of the kitchen and of the woman, we see this iconic scene where there's a camera shot out of a washing machine onto Carmen Maura, and so you can see how she's literally, quite physically, being trapped in this kitchen. It's all sort of coming in on her, and there's also the iconic shot in Volver of it's a bird's eye view shot looking down on Raimunda as she cleans the knife which has been used to murder Paco. And these cinematic shots make up some of what Brechtian distancing techniques Almodóvar uses in his films. It's constantly used as a reminder to the audience that they are watching a film. What they are watching isn't reality, it's not real life, as deep and complicated as his characters are. Some of his plot lines are quite far-fetched. There's lots of Byzantine plot lines in Almodóvar's films, and so this constantly reminds the audience that what they are watching is supposed to be teaching us something. It asks and invites the audience to ask, why am I watching this? What is the lesson to be learned? What can I take away from this? Who are these characters in my life? How am I echoing what I do in my everyday life as to what is shown on the screen? And so that makes Almodóvar's films very pertinent to the everyday person watching them, and very current, very up to date. Each one of his films is a sort of new event in this sort of timeline, this diary, and ends up being more of a political statement as well as an artistic piece. Almodóvar's style is very much melodramatic, with these far-fetched plot lines, but it doesn't fall into the sort of soap opera category because of the way that the Brechtian distancing techniques are used to frame his work, and the way it's composed strings everything together to give his work body. And another technique, the most notable technique that Almodóvar uses, is his lurid and bright, bold use of colours and visuals. The first thing you'll notice about his films when watching is in the opening titles there are sort of images, colours, all bursting out of the screen, and they are all with perfect reason. So in Volver, I will use this as my example, one of my favourite Almodóvar films. Reds, blacks, pink, blue are all colours that stand out. Some people might say that it would make his films more flat and more two-dimensional. However, the sort of boldness of it helps us to build the characters around the symbolism provided by the colours, and that makes it more three-dimensional in that sense. So with the example of Paula from Almodóvar's Volver, She is a daughter, she's one of the daughters in the film, a sort of teenager who starts off the film very, very innocent, wearing these pallid tones, pinks and blues. She's a teenager and she only has teenage worries at the beginning of the film. After her, as her aforementioned supposed father makes sort of sexual advances towards her, she only wears red after that point. And so we can see that sort of maturity in her. We can see how she's changed and how she's tainted by what has happened to her. Now, her mother, Raimunda, was also sexually assaulted in a similar way at the same age. And so she also wears only red throughout the duration of the film until the end. And so we can see that link between Raimunda and her daughter Paula both wearing red, that link between them, their bond becomes stronger through their shared experience. And that is an experience that will have been shared by many women in Spain throughout the duration of the dictatorship. And so we can see that through the use of colour. Almodóvar also uses this sort of contrast, you could say, with the kitchen towel placed by Raimunda in the kitchen at the beginning. Paco has just been murdered and there's blood all over the floor, and Raimunda takes this piece of white kitchen towel and you can see the red seeping through of the blood, and that can kind of symbolise how the purity and innocence of women is invaded. The rest of their sort of purity and innocence is being invaded by the men in their life and the cruelty that they bring, and the women are there to clean that up for the rest of the film. Thank you so much for watching my lecture on Pedro Almodóvar and his different signature techniques. I hope you enjoy his films as much as I do. Thank you very much.